Subhash Chandra Garg, former Economic Affairs Secretary of the Government of India, has...
Mr. Garg, many thanks for joining us on Bloomberg Queen.
Mr. Subhash Chandra Garg, in his 36 years of distinguished service with the government.
Former Economic Affairs Secretary and former Finance Secretary, Subhash Chandra Garg.
He was the main architect of the budget from the bureaucracy, Subhash Garg.
It's an honor for me, sir, to have you on the Proof of Work podcast. You don't need any introduction whatsoever. I think India knows you as a nation builder, as someone who has given your life to public service and has done instrumental work to contribute in actually shaping the economy that we have just now. Fifth largest economy, moving to the third largest economy. So it's a big privilege and honor for me to have you, to learn from you, and for my listeners, and most importantly for my students in India, to gain that insight from you on how to work, how to lead, and how to go about just living life professionally and personally so that they can contribute to the $10 trillion dream that you have so adequately proposed in your book, The $10 Trillion Dream for India as well. So, sir, extremely privileged and honored to have you, and welcome to the Proof of Work podcast.
Thank you, Shiv, for such a generous comment on what my life has been. It's such a pleasure to talk to a young man like you. So many dreams in the eyes and so much time to make them realize. So happy talking to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your time. Now, Subhash, sir, let's start off on a personal level. When did you realize public service was your calling? And how did you get started down this path from accountancy?
See, the accounting was not my preferred interest any time ever. Right in the beginning, in my school and college days, and you would recall those times in late 70s and early 80s, that is when I needed to make my career choice, were the heydays of socialism in the country. Though it was going bad, it was not delivering, but that was the situation. Still, any young man at that time looking for the career options and what he or she wants to do did not have a very vibrant, developed private sector in the country. We were still in that license permit Raj kind of situation, and mostly the private sector was in the kind of industry where there was much more demand and supply was inadequate, controlled for different reasons, and the private sector jobs were in a way considered to be something which were serving the people or the lalas and the industrialists in a way for their personal interests rather than serving the nation. I hold absolutely opposite view now about the private sector, but at that time this was the situation, and therefore almost everyone in those days used to go for either government jobs or the public sector jobs. That was considered to be more national, more serving the nation rather than serving or getting into some private business or advice. Therefore, to my mind, at that time, to me, it appeared that the Indian Administrative Service offered the best chance to not only deliver public service, which is in line with the idea of what the national duty or the national service is, but at the same time, this was also personally very rewarding, socially very enhanced. And therefore, sometime in around 1978 or 79, when I was in the first year of my college, I decided that the civil service, particularly the IAS, was my calling. And but the way there was competition for the IAS and the civil services, you can never be sure, however hardworking or maybe bright you are, you can never be sure that you would be selected. And therefore, in my judgment, I thought I needed a backup in case I don't make it to the civil service. And that is where I chose the accounting career. I enrolled myself into the Cost Accounting Institute of the country, and simultaneously I prepared for that, sat on those examinations, topped the country, and completed the cost accounting before I got selected into the IAS. It did help me in a way as well in the IAS, because I chose the accounting and the business administration as one of the two electives in the civil service, and the cost accounting course preparation was quite helpful in making that happen. So that in a way, to my mind, gelled, and it also helped me in a way when I wrote the IAS examination in October 1982. Then I had some months before the final results were to come, and I joined the only service I had outside the civil service in Oil India Limited for about 7 months. So it was a complementing choice. Civil service was the preferred career option, supplemented, backstopped by the cost accountant professional choice of the accounting profession, as you put it. And I didn't make a switch. It was not a switch. It was a harmonious blending of these two careers.
Got it. Wow, sir. So, I have come to know, I left India at a young age, and then I moved to Australia and immigrated there. So I was not really aware of how big and how competitive the Indian Civil Services exam is until I came last year. And having invested in an edtech startup in India, I got exposed to the edtech startup scene. I noticed that when you have startups like Unacademy, PhysicsWallah that have been built and got unicorn status, surely because of the revenue that they generate through preparing students for the Indian Civil Services exams and other form of exams, that exposed me of how big of a culture it is among the students over here to get to prepare for those exams, and it is their dream. And then the more I got introduced to the Indian entrepreneurial ecosystem since last year, I was made aware that the dream for the youth of the country is either to become a movie star, or to become a cricketer, or to start a company, become entrepreneur, or become an IS. So these four are 90% of an individual's dream now. So I can imagine, I can't imagine that you nailed the IS exam and you did chartered accountancy as well and nailed that as well. So you were always a bright person. Like you must have been a very bright kid as a child as well. Were there anything that your parents used to say that shararti hai tu bahut?
See, what you very elegantly and rightly described, this actually summarizes the change which has gone into last 40 odd years from the time when I was competing. Movie stars or movie actors or heroes was the dream of young men and the ladies even at that time, right? But to start a company or to become an entrepreneur wasn't the dream at that time, because the socialist setting. But today that has changed. Today you find Indians, bright young Indians, especially in what you see in the startup systems now, which is away from the family-owned businesses of the yesteryears, and the kind of education which has come up in our IITs and the IIMs, and which has produced enormous amount of global leaders in management and technology and all. So these have provided enormous amount of opportunities to young men to get into something beside or in addition to being a film hero or an IAS officer. That is the change which is there. And much of the socialist pattern of society has been sort of unraveled by now. It has rolled back, and we have a very vibrant and good private sector. Government still is present massively. So that is the change today, and the IAS still happens to be one of the most fascinating choices for a lot of young men, and India is full of talented young men and the women, so to say. But to respond to your question specifically, I indeed was a sort of naughty kind of child who would do a lot of shararats, etc. To my mind, this indicates an active mind. I don't think passive minds and dull minds do shararats and that kind of naughtiness parents. So in my subsequent life, I have always sort of treated the naughty childs with a lot of respect, and I see promise in them. So I don't think that's a bad quality.
Yeah.
In fact, it's good. The same activity of mind to my mind then also reflects in your studies, your achievements, games, elsewhere. The dull minds I don't think, do very well, even in other academic fields. So I did very well academically. I had enormous interest in reading hell of a lot. Also raise questions, that curiosity in classes, etc. Many times the teachers used to find me a little offensive because you would ask questions which they may not be very comfortable in answering, or you take positions where what they would be saying may not be right in my judgment. So if you question that, so teachers may sometimes not be very comfortable, but that's fine. So I think I was lucky. I get a sense that a lot of it comes from genes and the kind of cultural setting in which the child is raised. So from both these point of view, to my mind, I was helped in becoming a precocious, a kind of achieving childhood and academically reasonably well.
Now, sir, you touched upon the progress of India from the 70s till now and what has changed within the society and the culture as well. And when you got into public service, especially within the central government, which in Australia we call the federal government, you witnessed the India's growth story up close for decades. What key milestones stand out as transformative for you with regards to the India's?
See, I started consciously recognizing the change in our economy, especially. I won't talk about society today, but in the economy, which has been my primary area of interest, sometime in early 90s, or maybe the late 80s and early 90s, we can put it around 90, when I was sort of posted in Rajasthan to turn around a soybean processing plant established at a very high cost in those years' terms, with World Bank assistance or loans, and which had become literally stillborn, a white elephant, as everybody used to call it at that time. And I was posted there. Not a very typical IAS job, so to say, but probably my interest in economy, my sort of some training in accounting and this kind of thing made me to do very well over there. And at that time, since the production of, let us say, even oil and edible oil, which has been one of India's major import items, even today it is, the edible oil import. And then I started sort of dabbling into understanding the wider economy, linkages of the agriculture industry, and so my sort of greater conscious awareness about the changes in the economy started around that. And that was the time when India, a little later than in 90 or 92, when the economic reforms started. Delicensing happened, import-exports were opened, the foreign investment was allowed, Indian economy was opened up, and the private sector was allowed. Public sector thereafter did not sort of expand much. So that was, to my mind, the biggest milestone or biggest change which India witnessed, rightly so. And it so coincided with my sort of venturing into the economic space. So that, to my mind, I would rate as the largest milestone in my life. I am quite conscious that when India became independent in 1947, prior to that, for 100 years, our growth was less than 1%.
Really?
That is the kind of stagnation India was facing. And when the then policymakers after independence had to make choices, and it was the time when Soviet Union was the star, the communism had become a kind of global accepted equal kind of society. The war had just gone out, the World War II, the devastation, reconstruction, the colonization was coming to an end, and the days of democracy were getting established all over the world. So I can understand the policymakers of that time who made conscious choice to adopt a socialist pattern of society and a public sector oriented industrialization strategy, because private sector capital was much small, and a democratic bedrock of the nation. Those choices were understandable. In retrospect, by the time as I mentioned, in 1990s or so, it did appear, and there was overwhelming evidence to know that the public sector is not succeeding, or hamstringing the private sector was a bad strategy. Socialist federal society is more ideal than the real growth generator. Democracy, fortunately, in the country had got established quite satisfactorily. And so, though the changes which came up after independence did generate a growth which is much higher than the less than 1% prior to the independence. But it was in 3% of 2 to 3% kind of thing per capita. Very high compared to the previous 100 years, but much lower than what our ambition should have been, and what our competitors in the rest of the world are able to sort of generate much higher. So post-independence changes were also good, but not good enough. In 1990s, I would rate as the reforms as the right sort of change. The story is not complete in my judgment still. We have not carried out even that reforms. The changes happening in the global economy are much more profound now. Industrialization is getting old now. This is the time for digital economy, the environmental economy to be constructed for the world, including India. We need another pivot for that. Unfortunately, that's not happening as much as one would desire. But this is a change which I think we should bring about.
Amazing, sir. That's very insightful and very transformational for individuals like me and younger than me who do not necessarily know at a deeper level the like the 1847 to 1857 economic history of India as well. So that was a very profound answer to the question. Just quickly, sir, 1991, I was in India. I was a 2-year-old at that time. So in 1991, I was in India. I was born in India. But I know, like, even as a 3-4-year-old over time, that, there was a liveliness in the country. There was just a lot of liveliness because of the foreign products being able to come to India. A lot more TV channels rather than just Doordarshan as well. So a lot of things happened in 1991. I'm just keen to get your take on it. Now, it's apt that Dr. Manmohan Singh gets a lot of credit for it because I guess he was the poster child architect for the economic liberalization in the 90s. However, it was done under the prime ministership of P.V. Narasimha Rao. So for somebody like me, growing up, and I've been always fond of history. I've written a book on the history and evolution of money when I was doing my MBA at NYU, so I was always fond of history. And this is a part of India that I have lived as a kid for a brief period before I moved. So for me, P.V. Narasimha Rao was very transformational as well, although I do not understand the politics that goes into policy making. Do you think P.V. Narasimha Rao gets enough credit for the economic liberalization?
See, my sense is that we shouldn't get too much into this credit business for the reason because the real difference is the change which is made.
Sure.
Is that change adequately made? Who did it? It's quite complex, right? So P.V. Narasimha Rao, in my judgment, was, some people call him Chanakya. He was a person who understood the reality of the change which India needed, but who did not have courage or the political gravitas to make that change happen. The other person, Manmohan Singh, which you mentioned, was again a very knowledgeable, who had run the government in every which way and knew the government, and also knew very well that the policies which we had adopted, the choices which we had made, were not delivering. Both of them happened to be in a party which had laid out much of the system post 1947.
True.
So if you go back, or you sort of leave that legacy and start out on something new, then you are obviously disowning yourself in a way, or your own forefathers, or your such giants like Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi. So I would, unless you have already done, if you read the 1991 changes or reforms which were brought, and that policy resolution which was appended before the changes were introduced, you would find several pages devoted to the greatness of the policies which were adopted post-independence by Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi to pay tribute what had been done so far, and then try to sort of make the changes which you are going to introduce as a continuation of the policies adopted by their own. So in a way, trying to sell something to people of India, say, or the at least the party, not the people of India, the party people, that actually we are continuing the same. Ideally, you should have the courage to say that no, this didn't work. This is delivered such a small low rate of growth. We have still enormous poverty in the country, and our quality of life is actually suffering. And then we need to make a change. But our political class, that kind of courage is very missing, and therefore what many people today even describe, that the Indian reforms are made by steel rather than talking up front. Maybe that's what works in the cultural and 5,000 or 6,000 years of historical legacy which we have. I don't have expertise to get into that, but why we do act in this particular way. But to my mind, their enormous success was that they could make these profound and big changes, right? Therefore, whether you give Narasimha Rao a credit or Manmohan Singh, or to both of them together, or the Congress party all together, or with the civil servants of those time included, I don't think that's too much relevant. What is most relevant is that we made the right pivot, the right change.
Very rightly put, sir. And this is an education for me as well. I guess when you are in public service, you are devoting yourself towards the public good and towards the people of that nation. So when you're doing it, don't necessarily put it into your head that I have done this for the nation. It was your duty to do it. And secondly, I think what I get from you, and I've been exposed to the mainstream news channels of India now, I think a good education from you that I've got, and hopefully it's reached out to the listeners as well, is that even as commentators, we shouldn't think about who did what. They did their duty. What's matter is what you said just now. They brought a change. Let's leave it at that, and let's not get into the credit game. So I think you've put it aptly, and I thank you for imparting that education through your answer to me, as well as to our listeners and students. Just quickly, sir, because I find geopolitics very interesting. I'm a macro investor. I use global macro to invest in as a professional investor. Do you think economic liberalization of the 90s, I mean, it's a hypothetical. I know some people don't like to answer hypothetical questions, but do you think the economic liberalization of the 90s would have happened if the breakout of Soviet Union wouldn't have happened?
See, we are, as I said a little while earlier, we are a very old civilization, and I don't think we like to make abrupt shifts. For us, I think it's more ingrained that if we continue the path we have continued, that would be good. And incidentally, that 6,000 years of history also sort of include within it much of the period when we were the best in the world, most economically advanced, richest, and both economically and culturally and otherwise. So we have some sort of pride. I don't like being proud, but that's the sense which is there in the people, and therefore anything new which comes in is not necessarily very quickly rated as promising or acceptable kind of thing. Therefore, in 1991, by the time we were broke, we had foreign exchange crisis coming up. Yes. Our industrialization had suffered massively. Our poverty strategy was not working very well, and the collapse of Soviet Union, as you mentioned, had give a final stamp that the communist way of economic management is not the right way of economic management at all. Now, in this situation, if you don't change still, then you will continue on the miserable path, right? You would continue on a lower growth path. And therefore, I would think that a combination of factors, the collapse of communism, which indicated that the communist way of life is not the best growth strategy in the world at all, or not even a good growth strategy. At the same time, combined with a complete failure of the system we had adopted for 40 odd years earlier, that we would need to default if we continue that way. And enormous evidence which had come up from the Japans and the South Korea, then the Southeast Asia, and also the European transformation, etc., convinced that we were not on the right path. So all these things combined, and that made us make the change.
Yeah.
May not be perfectly willingly, but necessarily there was a change.
Now, sir, you also have an incredible experience being the executive director at the World Bank. So you worked at the highest levels representing India, even at the World Bank stage as well. If you would be open to sharing, I would value learning which experiences most expanded your perspective on governance during your tenure there.
So when I joined the World Bank in 2014 as India's executive director, which also included the constituency, the constituency also had Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka. The world had changed quite a lot from the time in mid-40s when the World Bank was created. You would recall the World Bank was created just when the world
Post-World War II.
and it was basically meant for reconstructing the world out of the war, including a lot of reconstruction in what we in 2014, which we considered as highly advanced and developed countries in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere. So when I landed there, I tried to reason with myself and in interactions and others that what is the continued relevance of the World Bank? In which way? You don't have a reconstruction agenda anymore, because there's a war not taken place, any major war had not taken place for many, many decades by the time. A good part of the world had actually economically advanced. There were many countries which had seen their incomes rising to very high per capita levels, and the poverty in those parts of the world had abolished, virtually got abolished. But there was a very large part of the world where still the growth was big issue, the poverty was another big issue. And another big change which I think everyone recognized at that time is that the carbon emissions had created a big climate crisis which was happening, and it would also made life of the quality of life of people quite miserable in many parts of the world because of the pollution which happens. Even today in India we face the enormous amount of. So the world was changed place, but the bank had not changed enough in my judgment at that. So in late 60s, they had adopted poverty alleviation as their principal goal. Reconstruction was, though it continued to be in its name, but it was no longer the principal objective. And it was struggling to bring in the element of public goods, which is basically global warming. How do you handle that? And I think it was very good and very educative to get into the World Bank at this point of time. And the developing countries like India had also grown, not fully, but still substantially, to make their presence felt much more strongly in the governance. But one of the things which I sort of worked there was that how do we bring the change in the governance and the objectives of the bank? You would recall that around that time, there was another realization which had happened, was that these banks like the World Bank and the ADBs of the world, they were essentially capitalized by the advanced countries of those days. They were not borrowing from them, but they were controlling their boards and as they control their capital, and thereby controlling the policy and the development agenda. Whereas the developing countries, which were the principal recipient of the financing from these institutions, were actually not setting they wanted to convert these banks into something where the developing countries had a much greater voice in setting its agenda and the finance. That was not happening. There was a lot of resistance to this idea. No one leaves control, and that was not very surprising. And then the developing countries, the borrowing countries, actually set up two new banks, the BRIC Bank and the AIB, where they have the kind of control which was was there. So I think my time, a little less than 3 years in the bank, was very well spent in understanding the global developmental challenge of the time, the relevance of these institutions like World Bank and all, and that presented to me what one needed to do that. So I worked there quite closely because if you want to change, the two things or three things to my mind were required. Number one, you need to have a much larger capital base to finance the much larger change in the developmental agenda. That's number one. Number two, that capital should be more in the hands of the developing countries so that they that reflect the current global reality, and that also reflects where the financing need to go. And thirdly, you make sure that they have much larger, they are able to set or reset the developmental agenda or these three things. I did work. Hopefully, I think we succeeded in getting the capital enhanced through both the World Bank. Also led that discussion, though the capital increase actually happened in 2018 or 19 when I had come back here, but I was still involved as the alternate governor of these institutions. So a lot of opportunities, the global view you get over in the World Bank, the kind of interaction which you have with the global leaders from all over the country, developing as well as advanced, the kind of instruments you can design leveraging your AAA status, otherwise, the kind of deeper examination you are able to do, that provided me a very good opportunity. And I hope I could make some contribution towards improved relevance. I don't think the agenda is still finished, that they have gone into the reforms. I don't think they are on the very right path. That would require, I think, another discussion someday. But there is a need for a wholesale transformation of the World Bank to make relevant and serve today's needs.
Sir, I'm totally aligned with your view. So in my book, I had written a chapter about World War II because, and just quickly on World War II, I think what I've noticed is that in Australia, for example, we learn about World War II, World War I significantly because Australia is still part of the Commonwealth nation. It's not a republic like how India is a republic. And the Australian population is anyways very less still. It was way less back in the 1940s. At that time, they didn't even allow immigration among non-white community at that time. So it was a very less population, and a lot of them went to fight war because Winston Churchill told them that, I need Australians to go and fight the war. That's a very controversial issue now in Australia. But nevertheless, World War II was a major change relating to everything when it came to the world. But I feel in India, because we were fighting the war for independence, the public knowledge about World War II among intellectuals like yourself is vast, but generally among the normal consensus, this is just my opinion, they may not necessarily be aware of how big of an impact was World War II, because India was probably fighting for its independence during that time. So that was a much more bigger event for them rather than World War II. So in my book, I have written a chapter about the post-World War II reconstruction and how Bretton Woods was created. And I am in total agreement with you. When I studied that, and Keynes was so influential in creating that whole institution, World Bank, IMF, and making sure that UK losing its global superpower and US becoming the global superpower, they kind of brokered a deal. And China and India got a very bad deal in that whole Bretton Woods financial system. And so when last year the war broke out between Russia and Ukraine, and America was using its SWIFT payment system and a whole lot of other systems as an economic power to defeat Russia. To me, it was that this is now the end of the Bretton Woods system. Yes, BRICS and all started a few years ago, but I think this is the turning point that is going to accelerate it further. So I'm in total agreement with you that these institutions they need to adapt because they have kind of lost their relevance. That was relevant at that time. And in a way, they were very swayed towards the winning powers of World War II. And China and India are very different now of the China and India of the 1945. We are economic superpowers. We've got the population dividend as well. Whether we utilize it or not, only time would tell. We are a populist democracy, at least for India. So I think that these institutions, they need to adapt, and that includes United Nations as well, with India getting a permanent seat, hopefully.
So, Shiv, what you described, and I would read your book, this is more about the IMF side than the World Bank, right?
Sure.
So the monetary management, especially the dollar and that kind of thing. Incidentally, if we are very objective, I don't think India got a bad deal in 1945.
All right. Okay. Sure. I'm keen to hear. Yeah.
I would suggest you read the RBI history has described in a great detail how India, despite not being an independent nation at that time, participated as a major influence in designing that system. And we were one of the 6 largest economies at that time.
Sure.
And we got a seat initially because the Russians did not join, as one of the countries who had the right to nominate a director instead of getting elected from the constituency. That status continued for early 60s, when by the time, since we had lost out further on the economic growth in front, then we lost out. And now we are perhaps going to, after some time, not now, to become one of those 6 largest economies which has right to nominate. So that, my mind, and we were at that time part of the what is known as the sterling era, because we were part of the British currency system at that time. Dollar was indirectly traded, and the whole of the world at that time was primarily based on the gold standard as the currency. Because gold determined the currency. Individual currency's value was derived from its strength vis-a-vis the gold, right? It was sterling was also evaluated, or it derived its strength or value from its relation to the gold. So gold was the primary every country's, and at that time a good part of your quota in the IMF was required to be contributed in gold.
Yes.
Because other currencies are not successful, and that system was not dollar. So what the dollar was accepted as the kind of replacement currency for gold, but dollar was valued in terms of gold.
True.
Right.
True.
There was that fixed exchange rate which the United States had to maintain in terms of the dollar gold conversion rate. It was only in 1971-72 when Nixon moved away, abolished that. So imagine at that time, the dollar was $35 when you were equivalent to 1 ounce of gold. Today it is about 1800. And so that led in 71, to my mind, a very, very, very good change, that the gold is a very poor monetary currency, so to say, because enormous limitations on it. The world entered into the era of flexible exchange rates, and that is actually, now we are in the game for last 50 odd years. Every country is in the floating era, literally floating exchange rates, and that is what determines. So if you are really strong economically, your currency strengthens or remains strong and stable. But if you are not strong economically, you can't design or fix a value to your currency without the real strength. So I would read this book, but my take is little. We sometimes into there's a lot of talk these days about dollar dominance being sort of required to be abolished, the excesses of the dollar, etc. These are emotional arguments. These are not real. The real strength comes from the real strength of your economy, not what your nominal exchange rate or whatever you desire as to be the nominal exchange rates. If you are strong, so like China you mentioned, China is become economically strong today with about 18-19 trillion dollar of the GDP. We have done well, but we have not done well enough. At about $3.5 trillion equivalent to the economy.
I totally totally agree with you, sir. And as you know, that India has got. I was amazed when I came last year that India has got a massive social media culture where social media influencers who might not necessarily have got training in a certain subject go out and tell stories, and just because they've got a big following, people end up believing it because they've got big followers. So I've come across certain economic theories and economic explanation pertaining to India and its current growth from social media influencers, and I've been amazed that that is considered a truth or reality by people. And on that, I want to make a quick point, and I know that when we met, we spoke briefly about it, but I think it's very important that people of the country who are at least somewhat know economics 101 realize that while it's great that India is the fifth largest economy, it's great, and it's on its way to become a third largest economy, we need to do something to increase the GDP per capita statistics of this nation, because that is what China, for example, has done exceedingly well. They went from a certain figure that we are at now to now I believe they are at above $6,500, or I think so around $8,000 the last time I read it. Whereas we are, I mean, people might not like hearing this, but we are less than Bangladesh when it comes to GDP per capita. So just because we've got a large population and we've got significant wealth inequality, we can feel good about ourselves that we are on our way to third largest economy. While it is good, it's not enough. And we need to work our way and think strategically on how we can increase the GDP per capita. And I've read your book, $10 trillion Dream, and I know that you're a big advocate of this. And I know that can't wait to read your next book as well, where you're going to briefly touch upon this subject as well.
So, Shiv, I can understand people desire to feel good. I think every human being wants to feel great. And that narrative of the third largest economy, or fifth now, third later, etc., if it makes people feel good, I have no problem. But the problem I have is that actually waylay us or distract us from what our task is. And in that, the conversation which you just started by bringing the per capita is so relevant. And ultimately, the GDP per capita or the national income per capita is what affords us the standard of life. If I earn $1,000 a month, I can buy goods and services of $1,000 per month. If that doesn't give me a good house to live in, a good car to travel, or manage my heat, summer heat by air conditioner or something, I may not actually be very happy otherwise being earning only $1,000 per month. Therefore, the significance of a higher per capita income, there are issues connected with the equality, redistribution thereof. We don't want to get into that right now. But if we take on an average the per capita income as the indicator of what an average Indian can buy in terms of goods and services, it indicates that what is the quality of life he or she can sort of live, and that includes health, education, other investments, etc., and expenditures. And therefore, being a third largest or second largest or fifth largest, to my mind, should not actually give you that sense of happiness or the satisfaction which, if you have a higher per capita income, should give you. And the other problem which I have with this narrative is that to sell a story, we should not sort of invent false parameters. So we would say that we have a highest growth amongst major economies. Now, what is major economy? Right. We don't tell. I did a little bit of exercise. I'll write next week about it. If you define a major economy by a simple criterion of minimum 10 million of population, that means that country should have 1 crore. There's too many small islands, etc., which are not to be compared with. So 1 crore or 10 million of population and only about 100 million of GDP, right? If you take that amongst the middle income countries, the World Bank has 108 countries classified as middle income countries. And if you scan them from these two criteria, you get about 25 countries. If we compare within this group, we are not the largest growing economy.
That is correct, yeah.
Mentioned Bangladesh, the Vietnam, there are many other countries which are doing much better. So I don't think we should employ the false narratives to make us feel good.
Yeah.
That would be called out very soon, and that
Yes,
doesn't
totally.
that doesn't really affect or improve the people's quality of life. So I think it's good to be a large economy, but not good enough unless we have a large.
Absolutely, sir. And I just want to make a quick comment. I know that we have overextended this particular question, but I want to make a quick point about this because I've been seeing so many of, finance, social media educators and influencers saying that life is good in India if you have money because the expenses are less. And while that could be true, I think the bigger point over here, again, which connects to GDP per capita, is that you want average Indians to be globally competitive and not just be siloed towards their purchasing power in India. Like Qatar has got one of the highest GDP per capita of around 80 to 90,000 US dollars. Now, we do not, sure, they are resource rich nations, so that's why they've got a high GDP per capita, but that's not the point. The point is that a Qatari can go anywhere in the world and can spend without any problems. An average an average Indian can't do that. And to say that life is good in India because an average Indian doesn't have as much expenses as the others defeats the purpose of living in a globalized world. So my message out to those influencers and to the people of India is that while it is good to feel all that, like you said, I'm in total agreement with that. Being an Indian Australian, I'm very proud of my Indian roots. And I think India as an independent nation has done well, but we shouldn't lose the big picture. There is room for improvement, and we want average Indian to be excelling globally, not just intellectually like other CEOs in Silicon Valley have showcased and Indians have showcased at a global level, but also we want average Indians to increase their purchasing power so that when they can go outside India, they have the purchasing power like how nations like Qatar have. So yeah, I just wanted to make that quick comment, sir.
I agree with you, Shiv. I would just add that besides being able to have a larger purchasing power when you go abroad, you actually need a larger purchasing power even domestically.
Yes.
Even within India, your purchasing power is much, much smaller than what your needs are. Right. So we need to do a very, very big hard work for many more years to make our average Indians have larger purchasing power in the country as well.
I'm in total agreement with you, sir. While we have spoken about this, sir, I want to go towards the future. So I think you as well, I look at things at a very high time piece. And I want to zoom out to 2047. And I would love if you can make a bold prediction as to where India realistically could be from an economic perspective by its 100th independence anniversary.
See, whenever you look into the future and try to make a scenario, a projection or a prediction as you term it, I think you need to do a kind of scenario analysis. I don't believe in this theory that everybody's fate is written when he or she is born, and therefore everything is predictable. No one knows that, and I don't think it's written that way as well. And therefore, whenever we think about 2047 or put it 2050, I think we need to get out of this mindset that 75 years of independence or 100 years of independence has any meaning. We are a much larger, longer, bigger civilization than the England which ruled us for 90 odd years. In my personal judgment, we should not even celebrate Independence Day, etc. That's too small part in our history of 5,000, 7,000 years. But that's beside the point. Let's take what you said, the little long shot, 2047. I would rate 2050 as the goal. There, my sense is that there are three likely scenarios. Right. The number one scenario is that we are able to put our act together, undertake very bold reforms which are required in the economic space, and then we have the ability to execute that reform agenda, and then what we will get in 2050. That's one scenario. Number two scenario is that we just do as we are doing, the business as usual kind of thing. Whatever is happening happening for last 10, 15, 20 years is continues to go on for the time of 2050. No bold reforms, no big reforms, etc. Much of the same context. The third one is, which is more original kind of scenario, where we get into more of the disruptions, problems. Let us say we get into a communal kind of further divide, or get into regional stick-ups, etc., or political engagement becomes more and more dysfunctional kind of thing. So that is the third kind of scenario. My sense is, if we are able to act according to scenario one, which is what the premise of my book, The $10 Trillion Dream, is. So in today's price, or today's dollar, I believe that we can generate a dollar growth about 10 to 12% per annum for that long, and we can be a 35 to 40 trillion dollar economy by that time, if we are able to do this. Now, but if we do as business as usual, which is what is happening, we still have a lot of entrepreneurial class, our investment gets taken place, government does capex, etc., and many other things which keep on happening as they are happening. We will probably generate the dollar growth of about 5 to 6% per annum on average. That will probably take us to somewhere close to about 15 to 20 trillion dollar by that time. The third one, if that happens, I suspect that our dollar growth might not exceed about 4% per annum, and then we might not even reach 10 trillion by 2050 in that situation. So I don't think anyone can predict. I have no means to do that which one of the scenario will play out. I would wish and work for the scenario number one to happen. And if that happens, the history of India doesn't inspire that confidence that it will happen, but we have capability. We can do it if we as a nation, as a people, rise to make it happen. And I would like that to happen. But if we are not careful, if we fall into these traps, some of which are emerging in the country right now, then it's not unlikely that you get into the third situation as well. And of course, if we meander our way like we've been doing, that business as usual is, to my mind, the likely scenario.
Sir, I hope that you give me some time in the future so that we can deep dive on that first scenario and how we can achieve that. I think that'll be a great deep dive session to do it. But for this podcast episode, I'm going to ask you my final question. And I again thank you very much for your generosity in giving me so much of time, because I know you're a very busy person. Lastly, sir, as an elder statesman, what wisdom might you impart to India's youth seeking purpose today?
See, my assessment is that Indian youth is quite a gifted person. Everybody, in a way, has 90 odd billion of neurons in the mind, so that's fine. But the way we have evolved, the family, the society, the system, etc., I think our youth has enormous potential and sort of promise in them. Now, the trouble starts when we see the kind of ecosystem in which they develop, own their skills and talent and execute it. The domestic Indian ecosystem is not that sort of conducive. That is why our youth is actually not able to realize their true talent and potential in the country. You have lived abroad. Why? I think this is a very simple question. Why do Indians, when they go abroad, do so well? Why the bulk of Indian, the same stock, doesn't do that well when they are here? Some people may try to answer by saying that, only the most talented go out, and if they and the remaining is not that talent. This is, in my judgment, absolutely wrong.
Agreed.
The best of the talent still remains here. And
Agreed.
You can test it by that if those guys who went out and did very well, if they were to come back to the country, will they be able to do as well here? And you will find the answers. So I don't think I'm the one who can provide any wisdom or any advice. But if I analyze the situation as it is, I've seen it very up close. Enormous talent in our people.
Agreed.
for them to do well and for them to do well for their country, I think they should fight, which they don't do. They should work to make the ecosystem better. Because it's there in their end, it is their journey which is most affected, and they should go out to the world, conquer the world. We have too many. We don't need too many of us here, whereas the world which is aging and otherwise need Indian talent. So we should do both. One, improve the domestic environment ecosystem for our talent, our youth to do real well, and we must go out in much of the same numbers to sort of help the world and help us in the process. I think that's what it is. I don't have very specific advice. I don't think I can provide that.
Sir, you are very humble and modest. Honestly, I just want to call out that Subhash Sir is the most humble and modest individual that I have ever met in my life. It's very modest of you to answer it that way, sir, but I am in total agreement. So, having been in India since last year, India's youth, some of my peers, extremely talented individuals. They are more talented than me. They are more talented than many of the people that I met while I was in New York University. So I think the narrative that talented people go out of India and that's why they succeed is totally false. And I'm also in agreement with you that the environment is more friendly to succeed in countries like America. This is where I'll probably not put Australia in the same category as US as well. US has got just an incredible entrepreneurial culture. Like I used to tell my friends when I came back from my MBA at NYU and came back in Australia and they're like, you're a published author. I'm like, this would have never happened in Australia. It happened in US because not getting into society and politics or the culture over there, but it's just an incredible entrepreneurial culture that only cares what you can contribute. They don't look at anything else. So I think US entrepreneurial culture is just a class apart. But coming back to what you said about India has got enormous potential. I have no doubt about it. But the point that you made, that correct me if I'm wrong, you mentioned something about that they don't fight to improve the system. That's what you said, right? Yes.
We are too differential towards the state, the politicians. We don't take things up front. Whatever wrong is happening, we don't contest. We don't present. In that sense, we are a little flawed democracy also, to my mind. And whether it's our industrialists, whether it's our entrepreneurial people and or youth, I think they should be a little more assertive about setting things right rather than accept meekly what is trotted out by the politicians and the policymakers. That's
just
what
on that. Total agreement with you, sir. In my limited year observation about the country, having met really respected leaders, corporate leaders, startup leaders, I'm just amazed. This is the stark contrast between US and India when it comes to entrepreneurial culture. That over there, they make things happen. The entrepreneur class make things happen, even if it is like getting head-to-head towards a regulatory apparatus, a political apparatus. And this is regardless of whatever political parties, like just, they fight for what they think is right. But in India, I think you put it aptly. I think they need to be able to show more strength internally, which they are not able to. And they might have their own reason. I might need to live more in India to understand that cultural context as to why they're not able to. But yeah, that is definitely a big thing that they're not able to fight it. Now, sir, the next segment, our round, is the famous rapid fire questions round. As you know, 1 to 3 word responses and yes or no as well. And I think I do not need to say to you, sir, how you answered the question, that please answer all the questions and be playful. I think you will answer all of them anyway. So if you're ready, sir, I'll start the rapid fire questions.
All right.
What are you most proud about being an Indian and India?
I don't think anybody should be looking for being proud about. One should look at what one is most satisfied about, and one should have a sense of duty. What is my leftover agenda? If you are conscious of the leftover agenda, I think you would be doing more towards achieving that rather than resting on your oars and being proud of it.
Got it. Very profound. Very profound. I'm digesting what you said, and it's very profound. Very alternative as well. What is more vital for progress, truth or courage?
Both.
Yes, sir. Exactly. Truth and courage both. I guess you need courage to seek the truth as well, especially in an environment like so. Both are.
It's not an easy thing to achieve and to defend. truth need a lot of hard work
Yeah.
as well as courage to acquire, earn,
Yes.
learn truth, and to make it
The best period of your career. If you need to pick a year, best period of your public service career.
every year.
Love it, sir. Love it. I need to learn a lot from you on how to answer some of these questions. Life's meaning.
Stay on what you believe very strongly and without sort of swayed by considerations which are not really very genuine and
Cool, sir. Good life philosophy.
I don't know philosophical side, but if your question is towards what your most sort of engaging consideration or thought is, to me it is to build an Indian economy, to get to work for, to generate high rate of growth, as well as a very genuine and impartial redistribution, and finally to improve the quality of people and environment. That's my
Very up, sir.
personally, to be happy, prosperous, and healthy. Whatever makes it happen is the right thing to do, and whatever does not make it happen in long term is something not desirable.
Very up, sir. Failed policy worth revisiting.
We have revisited some. For example, this reservation of most of the key sectors of the economy or the public sector, that has been revisited. But another failed policy, to my mind, is to have very large presence of the public sector in the country. I think there is a lot of loss of productivity of capital as well as labor and waste of public resources. So if we can revisit and privatize most of our public sector, including financial sector, etc., I think we would do a big service for the country.
Economic growth over social welfare or social welfare over economic growth?
Both. Very simple.
Both. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Leadership quality most needed for the youth of the country.
Sort of, to my mind, is acquire the right kind of knowledge and skill to make you a productive economic human being, and then sort of do hard work to realize that talent.
Absolutely, sir. Lastly, sir, greatest teacher in life thus far for you?
I think nature and the people of India.
Wow, amazing, sir. Sir, this has been the most insightful, most fulfilling conversation, podcast or otherwise, that I've had. And despite having it done in such a professional context, you were so candid with your answers that I'm humbled. And I couldn't thank you enough for taking out the time and just doing this podcast with me, sir. This was very insightful, very profound for me. And I'm looking forward to more conversations with you. And despite being an Indian Australian, like I said, I'm very proud of my Indian roots. And I also have a dream, like you, that I hope India achieves its potential very genuinely. And more importantly, that the people of this country, which I believe are the most resilient people in the world. I think Indians are the most resilient people in this world. They are able to stay happy and succeed despite all whatever is thrown against them. I feel they deserve better. So I have a similar dream as you, sir. And if there is any way that I can work alongside you, work for you to make our common dream happen for the nation, I would love to be part of that, sir. So thank you very much for your time today.
So thank you, Shiv. This has been really an enjoyable conversation. I enjoyed every bit of it.